When we moved into Eastbrook Heights 3 years ago, I honestly believed we'd found our forever home. Tree-lined streets, neighbors who waved at each other, and a charming neighborhood park where kids still played until the streetlights flickered on. I thought we'd found a slice of decency in a world growing colder by the day. I didn't see the rot hiding under the manicured lawns and freshly painted fences. It started subtly. A citation for my son's pickup truck being unsightly because he parked it in our own driveway. A warning letter about my overly political yard sign that simply said support our teachers. A cold shoulder from the HOA president, Judith Mansfield, when I brought homemade cookies to a meeting, but I shrugged it off. Every neighborhood has its quirks and the dues were manageable. My son Elijah turned 17 last September. Quiet but razor-sharp, he's always had a soft heart and a spine of steel when it matters. He started volunteering downtown at the Homeless Outreach Center with some friends from school. The first time he came home after passing out care packages, his eyes lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years, not since his dad passed. He smiled at me, Mom, Elijah said, washing peanut butter off his hands. This guy, James, said he hasn't eaten anything warm in 3 days, but he shared his sandwich with his dog anyway. That was Elijah, seeing someone else's pain lit a fire in him. After a few weeks, he came to me with an idea. Why do we have to go downtown? There are people near here who could use a hand too. I mean, Eastbrook's nice, but go 2 blocks past the gate and things change real fast. I knew what he meant. There was a stretch under the overpass just 5 minutes from our subdivision where a small tent community had cropped up. Forgotten veterans, single moms, runaway teens, all human beings trying to survive. Elijah wanted to make fresh sandwiches, wrap them up with some water bottles and socks, and pass them out a few evenings a week. He even used his savings from mowing lawns to buy the food himself. The first night he did it, I followed behind in my car just to be safe. The people were grateful, kind, some cried. One woman hugged him and said, "No one ever looks at us like we matter, but you do." But kindness is a threat to people who rule through control. 2 days later, a letter appeared taped, yes, taped to our front door. Notice of unauthorized distribution activity, violation of HOA Ordinance 14B. Apparently, Elijah was engaging in prohibited acts of solicitation, and was warned to cease and desist all distribution of goods and materials within Eastbrook Heights and surrounding common areas. We live in a gated community. Elijah never passed anything out inside the neighborhood, but Judith Mansfield and her compliance committee had decided his actions were tarnishing the community's image. He was warned. And when Elijah didn't stop, things got worse. 3 days later, Elijah came home shaken. He'd been sitting at the park's edge by the public sidewalk handing out food when a white SUV rolled up. A man in a neon vest with a clipboard stepped out and asked if he had a permit to operate a food service. Elijah politely explained he was giving it away for free. No money, no donations, just helping. The man took pictures anyway, of him, his setup, his face. The next day we got another letter, this time from Eastbrook Heights Security Council, a subcommittee I'd never heard of. It said Elijah was being monitored for repeated violations and potential criminal activity involving unauthorized public service operations. That same week, Elijah's school principal called me. Someone from the HOA had contacted the school, suggesting Elijah may be involved in unregistered activism. Unregistered activism, he's 17. He was handing out sandwiches and socks. And then things escalated from absurd to terrifying. It was a Saturday morning when the doorbell rang. 2 uniformed officers stood outside, one of them holding a clipboard. Their demeanor wasn't aggressive, but I could tell they were uncomfortable. "We're here to speak with Elijah Martinez," one of them said. "There's been a report filed regarding distribution of food without a license and potential ordinance violations tied to Eastbrook Heights' private property clauses." Elijah stood behind me, stunned. "Are you saying my son is being investigated for feeding people?" I asked. The officer glanced at the clipboard. "We're just following up on the complaint. The HOA filed a statement claiming your son is creating a nuisance, potentially putting the community at risk of civil liability if someone becomes ill." I looked at Elijah. His face was pale but his eyes burned. He wasn't going to apologize for what he believed in. That night I wrote a long post on the community app. I attached photos of Elijah's sandwiches, the simple brown bags with handwritten notes that said "You matter and stay strong." I explained everything he'd done and how he was now being threatened with legal action. It was flagged and removed in under an hour. I knew then that we weren't just fighting pettiness. This wasn't just about HOA rules or property values. This was about power. about a small group of people so obsessed with control they were willing to criminalize kindness to protect their illusion of order. Judith Mansfield had built herself an empire of silence and fear. But she had made one mistake. She came for my son. And I wasn't going to let that slide. The next morning, I found tire marks in the mulch by our mailbox and a crushed brown bag near the curb. Elijah had left early to deliver his usual care packages, but someone had clearly come by with the intent to intimidate. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They made sure we knew they were watching. I crouched and picked up the torn paper bag. The note inside, written in Elijah's handwriting, still read "Stay strong." A peanut butter sandwich had been flattened beneath a bootprint. Judith always said Eastbrook Heights was about preserving community standards. What she really meant was maintaining control over the image she curated like a storefront window. Any crack in the glass was a threat, and Elijah had taken a hammer to it. I didn't tell Elijah about the bag. He'd been tense already, quiet in a way I hadn't seen since the funeral. He didn't want to stop, and I knew he wouldn't, but he was starting to feel alone. So I made calls. The first person I reached out to was my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She was 84, used a walker, and had lived in Eastbrook Heights longer than anyone. She once told me Judith tried to fine her $50 for having too many wind chimes. I asked if she knew anyone else who might have had run-ins with the board. By the end of the day, I had a list, 7 families. There was Malik, a paramedic who'd been fined twice for parking his ambulance in front of his house after long shifts. Priya and Nisha, a married couple who received anonymous complaints every time they held Diwali celebrations. And Jorge, a retired veteran, whose granddaughter's wheelchair ramp had been labeled a non-conforming structure. We met that night in my backyard under a strand of cafe lights Elijah had hung last summer. I told them what had happened, how Elijah had gone from feeding people to being treated like a criminal. They're trying to scare him into stopping, I said. They're trying to bury him under rules no one agreed to, but if we let them do this to him, what's stopping them from coming for the next person? Mrs. Thompson clutched her cardigan. I've lived through worse than Judith Mansfield, but I'll be damned if I let her bully a child for being kind. Malik nodded. I'll talk to some people at the station. If she's abusing emergency services or misrepresenting complaints, we need to document that. And so began what Elijah later called the Sandwich Rebellion. We started collecting everything. Every letter, every citation, every voicemail left by the compliance coordinator. Priya and Nisha scanned the HOA bylaws and found something interesting. There was no clause against giving away food. There was a clause that allowed board members to request increased neighborhood security for community threats, but it had to be voted on by residents. There been no vote, no warning. Judith was wielding power she didn't actually have. Then came the HOA meeting. They held it at the clubhouse, lavish, over-air-conditioned, with decorative lemons in tall glass vases like some kind of suburban Versailles. Elijah didn't want to come at first. He said, "They're not gonna listen, Mom. They've already decided I'm the problem." I told him that wasn't the point. The point was to show them he wasn't alone. When we arrived, the room was already full, more than I'd ever seen. Dozens of neighbors, some I barely recognized, others I knew had been afraid to speak out for years, but now they were here, for Elijah. Judith sat at the front in a crisp mauve blazer, flanked by her usual minions. Richard, the treasurer who never blinked, and Carol, the secretary who always looked like she was smelling sour milk. Judith tapped her gavel twice. Let's begin. First item, unauthorized activities conducted by minor resident Elijah Martinez, constituting a violation of community safety protocols and grounds for disciplinary action. Before she could continue, I stood. You don't have that authority, I said. There's nothing in the bylaws that gives you the right to target residents for feeding people outside the gates, especially not a minor. Her smile was thin and brittle. We are merely enforcing standards. Food distribution can attract undesirable attention. Elijah stood then. He looked around the room, voice steady but thick. They're human beings, not vermin. They're cold and hungry and tired. I give them socks and sandwiches. That's not dangerous. That's decent. Carol muttered something about liability. That's when Jorge spoke up. My granddaughter needs a ramp. You find me for installing it. You think that's about liability too. More voices joined in. You ticketed my wife for planting native flowers. You said my son couldn't sell lemonade without a business license. You took pictures of my house without telling me. The room was no longer quiet. It was alive, years of small humiliations rising like a wave. Judith slammed her gavel. Order, this is not the time for a free-for-all. Malik stepped forward holding a folder. Actually, it is. You called the police on a teenager. You reported him for criminal activity. We requested a copy of that complaint. There's no mention of community votes. No documented public safety concern, just your name, over and over. Richard squirmed in his seat. Carol scribbled furiously. Judith stayed still. This isn't about safety, I said. It's about control. Silence again, tense, heavy. Judith finally spoke. We'll take this under advisement. Which in HOA terms means we just got caught and we're figuring out how to save face. But they underestimated what they started. Because the next morning, Elijah got a message from someone who had been at the meeting, a high school senior named Torre. She said she wanted to help. That night they packed twice as many meals. Elijah created a QR code that linked to a simple site, Neighbors Not Nuisances. It included videos, facts about homelessness, and a map of resources. They put the code on each bag. And then something unexpected happened. Someone shared the story on Facebook, then Reddit. Then a local reporter reached out asking if Elijah would do an interview. He said yes, but only if he could bring a few of the people he'd been feeding. The segment aired on a Tuesday evening. The headline read, Teen faces HOA threats for feeding the homeless, responds with kindness. By the next morning, our driveway was full of grocery bags dropped off by strangers. Judith didn't just lose control of Elijah, she'd lost control of the narrative. But the worst was yet to come. Because Judith wasn't done. She was about to try something even more dangerous. And this time it wouldn't just be a letter. The day after the news segment aired, Elijah got a letter addressed directly to him. No return address, just a plain white envelope slipped into our mailbox like a secret. Inside was a typed, unsigned warning. Cease all activity immediately. You are in violation of municipal health codes and may face legal repercussions, including detainment. This is your final notice. No letterhead, no signature, no official seal, just fear disguised as authority. I took it to the police. The officer at the front desk recognized us from the news and sighed when he read the letter. This isn't legal. This is harassment, probably someone trying to scare you into backing off. I nodded, but someone is trying to make this look like a criminal case. He looked at me for a long moment. Have you considered filing for a protective order? That night, Elijah barely ate. He sat on the couch holding his phone, scrolling through texts and messages from people we'd never met, parents, students, former foster kids, even veterans, thanking him for what he was doing, telling him not to stop. I won't, he said, but I don't want to put you in danger either. You're not, I told him. You're making this place finally face itself. But then Judith made her move. The next Saturday, Elijah went to deliver meals with a few friends from school. I stayed behind. A neighbor had tipped me off that there was going to be a special meeting of the HOA's executive committee, closed door and unannounced. I parked across from the clubhouse with my windows cracked, phone in my lap recording. Through the glass doors, I could see Judith, Richard, and Carol, along with a man I'd never seen before, bald, sharp-suited, and very much not a neighbor. The man carried a briefcase and spoke with his hands, gesturing to a folder that Judith leafed through with narrow eyes. Every so often, Richard nodded solemnly. 30 minutes later, the man left. I tailed him in my car, staying 3 cars back. He drove to the municipal courthouse, parked in a reserved space, and walked through a side entrance. I looked him up when I got home. His name was Victor Parr, a code enforcement attorney. The next week, Elijah was officially served. A uniformed courier came to our door and handed him a summons. The HOA, backed by a civil complaint prepared by Victor Parr, was attempting to press formal charges through the city for violations of public food distribution statutes, claiming Elijah had endangered the health and safety of the community and failed to obtain a permit for recurring public activity. They were literally trying to have my 17-year-old son arrested for handing out sandwiches. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was war. And they weren't ready for what came next. I called a friend of mine, Erica, a civil rights attorney I hadn't spoken to in years. I sent her everything, the letters, the footage, the envelope, even the HOA bylaws. By Monday, she had a team assembled. They filed a countersuit, not just against the HOA, but specifically naming Judith Mansfield and her executive committee for abuse of power, harassment of a minor, and civil rights violations related to community discrimination and intimidation. But we weren't stopping there. Erica had contacts at several nonprofit organizations that specialized in protecting youth activists and fighting criminalization of aid work. By Thursday, Elijah had a legal defense fund, an advocacy campaign, and a pro bono team of experts ready to dismantle every bogus claim Judith had tried to erect. And while all of this was brewing, Elijah kept feeding people. Only now he wasn't alone. Every day more students joined, then teachers, nurses, off-duty firefighters. They started calling it Operation Full Plate. Care packages were being prepped in driveways and garages across the city. One elementary school started a food drive in Elijah's name. People who had once looked the other way when they passed a tent now stopped to ask what was needed. Judith couldn't keep up. She called an emergency meeting, this time open to the public, likely hoping to reclaim some control. But when she walked into the clubhouse, she found more than just residents. The media was there. So were representatives from 2 national nonprofits, an ACLU lawyer, and several people from the unhoused community, including a man named Raymond, who had been receiving Elijah's meals for weeks. Raymond spoke during the open floor. This young man didn't just bring food, he brought dignity. You people are trying to punish him for it. That tells me everything I need to know about your version of community. The room was silent. Judith stared, lips tight, her hands folded like prayer knives on the table. Then someone in the back shouted, "I move to hold a vote of no confidence in the HOA board." There was no stopping it. Someone brought out a clipboard. Signatures began to flow. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't have to. His work spoke louder than Judith's gavel ever could. By the end of the night, over 60% of the neighborhood had signed the petition. That was enough to trigger a recall vote under HOA bylaws. Judith stood and tried to retake the mic. But this time, no one was listening. Because power built on fear will always collapse when people remember they're stronger together. What came next was a blur of court dates and press interviews. The city dropped all charges against Elijah within a week once Erica's team showed how much the HOA had overstepped. In fact, the city began investigating the HOA's finances, contracts, and procedural violations. Victor Parr quietly recused himself from further legal action and disappeared from public view. But Judith, she wasn't done, not yet. Because people like her never step down, they dig in, they fight dirtier. And in her desperation, she made a final, reckless move. A move that would cost her everything. Judith Mansfield refused to go down quietly. The more signatures we gathered, the more press Elijah got, the more Judith seemed to unravel. Her mask of polite tyranny began to slip. At first it was subtle, snide remarks caught on neighborhood cameras, scowls at passing children wearing Operation Full Plate pins, complaints filed under fake names about suspicious foot traffic on our street. Then it escalated. A week before the official recall vote, we woke up to find our garage door spray-painted in red. "Get out, charity scum." The words cut through the early morning fog like a wound. Elijah stood in front of it, jaw clenched, holding a bucket of soapy water in one hand and a sponge in the other. He didn't say a word, he just started scrubbing. I helped him, tears hot behind my eyes. 2 houses down, Mrs. Thompson rolled up in her motorized scooter and handed Elijah a bottle of heavy-duty cleaner. "I've lived through Jim Crow and Reagan," she said. "I'm not going to let a bitter woman with a gavel and a God complex undo my faith in young people." We cleaned the garage, but the neighborhood was watching, and the mood was shifting. Then came the break-ins. Not into our home, but into the community clubhouse. The doors were found ajar one morning, filing cabinets ransacked. HOA documents, board meeting recordings, expense ledgers, all scattered and tampered with. Judith immediately sent out an official notice accusing certain residents of orchestrating the break-in to intimidate the board and disrupt official HOA proceedings. But something felt off. Erica, sharp-eyed and suspicious, requested the clubhouse security footage through a public information claim. And that's when everything unraveled. The footage showed Judith herself entering the clubhouse just after midnight, alone. She unlocked the door with her personal keycard, rummaged through the files, and was seen stuffing papers into a tote bag before yanking the camera wire from the ceiling. Unfortunately for her, the camera had already uploaded the footage to the cloud. Erica's team immediately filed a report with the city's Department of Neighborhood Affairs. Within 48 hours, a formal investigation was launched into financial misconduct, and obstruction of HOA governance procedures. Then came the bombshell. It turned out Judith had been diverting community funds for enhanced security consultations from a private firm, which didn't exist. The bank account linked to those payments was traced back to her nephew in another state. The HOA treasury was missing nearly $42,000 over 2 years. And just like that, the story changed. No longer was Elijah the target, Judith was. The local news ran the headline: HOA president under investigation after targeting teen for feeding the homeless. Suddenly, reporters camped out at Judith's cul-de-sac. She stopped showing her face. Her front yard, once pruned like a botanical display, became overgrown and dry. Her allies on the board, silent, some quietly resigned. But the damage had already been done. The night of the recall vote, the community hall was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls and people stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, young and old, new residents and longtime homeowners, and they weren't there for Judith. When the votes were tallied, the results were read aloud by the interim board secretary, a retired judge named Marlene who had once been fined by Judith for improper holiday decor. The room was dead silent. By a vote of 142-9, Judith Mansfield is hereby removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Applause erupted. Someone brought cake. Judith wasn't there. She submitted a statement claiming she was under medical stress and temporarily unavailable. But Elijah was there. He stood near the back, shoulders straight, surrounded by his friends and a few of the unhoused neighbors he'd met, Raymond among them. When the cheers died down, the judge called him up. Elijah, this community owes you something most of us don't say often enough. Thank you. Elijah nodded, swallowing hard. I just did what I thought was right. We all should. The recall was a victory, but it wasn't the end. In the days that followed, a special interim committee was formed to audit the HOA. Policies were rewritten. Fines from the last 3 years were suspended pending review, and one of the first changes made. A new bylaw allowing for resident-led community outreach programs, including food distribution, clothing drives, and advocacy events. Elijah was asked to help write it. But Judith still wasn't done. 3 days later, we received a letter, this one stamped, legal, from Judith's attorney. She was filing a defamation lawsuit against Elijah, claiming irreparable damage to personal reputation, emotional trauma, and character assassination via social media. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, staring at it. She's suing me for being right. I nodded slowly, because the truth shamed her more than any lie ever could. We didn't back down. Erica's team responded swiftly, filing a motion to dismiss and a counterclaim for malicious prosecution. They also subpoenaed every document related to Judith's private security contracts. Turns out the rabbit hole went deeper. The same security firm that Judith claimed was consulting on community safety had billed for false patrols, visits that never occurred. Witnesses confirmed Judith had used the HOA funds to surveil specific homes, including ours, without resident approval. She hadn't just abused power, she weaponized it. Within weeks, her lawsuit was dismissed. But the city had enough. Judith Mansfield was formally charged with embezzlement, falsifying financial documents, and criminal misrepresentation of municipal authorities. She was arrested outside her home, barefoot in a robe, yelling about how this used to be a respectable neighborhood. I watched from the sidewalk. Elijah stood beside me, a bag of donated socks in one hand and a box of granola bars in the other. He didn't say anything, he didn't gloat. He just turned to me and said, "There's still work to do." And he was right. Judith Mansfield's arrest was the kind of poetic justice you never really expect to see in real life. Yet there it was, raw and undeniable, handcuffs clicking behind the same woman who once tried to outlaw wind chimes and told children their chalk drawings were urban graffiti. The image made its rounds online. Local news aired a segment titled "From Boardroom to Booking, The Fall of Eastbrook's Iron Lady." But in our home, the celebration was quiet. Elijah didn't care much for headlines. The same night Judith was booked, he was at the community church kitchen helping restock their pantry. It was cold and his jacket had a hole in the sleeve, but he didn't complain. He never did. After everything, he could have walked away, said he'd done enough, but that's not who he was. The new interim HOA board invited him to join a resident advisory council, but he politely declined. He didn't want titles, he wanted change. So he focused on what mattered. We helped organize a neighborhood-wide food and essentials drive. Not just for those living on the streets, but for working families, single parents, elderly residents on fixed incomes, the invisible need hiding behind perfect hedges and pressure-washed driveways. The turnout was overwhelming. People came from neighboring towns. Kids donated allowance money to buy canned soup. Teenagers hosted bake sales. A retired contractor donated an entire cargo van for deliveries. And right there in the middle of it all was Elijah, handing out care bags, laughing with volunteers, making sure no one walked away empty-handed. That's when the mayor's office reached out. They invited Elijah to speak at a city council meeting about youth engagement and community outreach. It wasn't a flashy affair, no cameras, no viral moments, just a teenager in a borrowed dress shirt talking about dignity, about how no one should be punished for caring. Afterward, a council member approached us. "I have a son Elijah's age," he said. "He spends more time online than talking to people, but he watched your son's story, and for the first time he asked me how he could help." That was the thing about Elijah, he didn't just change a neighborhood, he sparked something deeper. A few weeks later, the council passed a motion to allocate funding for mobile outreach programs, including food distribution, mental health services, and job resources. The pilot program was named the Elijah Initiative. When we told him, he blinked twice and said, "Wait, what?" like he genuinely couldn't believe people were listening. But they were. And Judith. Her trial loomed. The evidence was overwhelming: bank statements, falsified board votes, surveillance misuse, and the attempted weaponization of legal channels against a minor. She eventually took a plea deal in exchange for testifying about broader corruption in several affiliated HOA boards in the region. Turns out, she wasn't the only self-anointed queen trying to rule over neighborhoods like they were petty monarchies. Elijah called it a whole Karen cartel. I couldn't argue. Judith was sentenced to house arrest and community service, assigned ironically to a local nonprofit that provided meals and clothing to the unhoused. Whether she learned anything, I'll never know. But Elijah, he learned plenty. He learned that power doesn't always come from titles or rules. Sometimes it comes from a sandwich wrapped in foil with a note that says you matter. He learned that some people will fight harder to protect their image than to protect their neighbors. And he learned that no one is too young or too small to start a ripple that becomes a wave. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the sun low and golden, Elijah leaned back and said, "You know, I used to think kindness had to be quiet, that it was supposed to be invisible, but maybe sometimes it has to be loud." I smiled. "You've made it thunder. Eastbrook Heights isn't perfect. There are still arguments about recycling bins and lawn heights, but the fear is gone. People talk to each other now. We've seen what happens when silence is used as a shield for cruelty, and we've decided we won't go back." Mrs. Thompson now leads a community gardening club. Malik helped start a neighborhood emergency response team. Jorge's granddaughter got a new wheelchair ramp, painted sky blue with flowers down the side. And every Saturday morning, a line forms just outside the gates, near the sidewalk under the tall oak tree. People come from across the city, not to protest, not to argue. To receive warm food, clean socks, smiles. Elijah stands at the front of the table, handing out sandwiches with one hand and shaking hands with the other. Sometimes he's joined by friends, sometimes by strangers who saw his story and felt less alone. And taped to every single paper bag is the same note he wrote on that very first night. "Stay strong. Because kindness, when refused permission, becomes revolution." And my son, my brave, stubborn, justice-fueled son, didn't just feed people. He fed a movement.